The ancient Egyptians had an elaborate set of funerary practices that they believed were necessary to ensure their immortality after death. These rituals and protocols included mummifying the body, casting of magic spells, and burial with specific grave goods thought to be needed in the Egyptian afterlife. The burial process used by the ancient Egyptians evolved throughout time as old customs were discarded and new ones adopted, but several important elements of the process persisted. Although specific details changed over time, the preparation of the body, the magic rituals involved, and the grave goods provided were all essential parts of a proper Egyptian funeral. History. Though no writing survives from pre-dynastic Egypt, scholars believe the importance of the physical body and its preservation originated there. This would explain why people of that time did not follow the common practice of cremation, but rather buried the dead. Some also believe they may have feared the bodies would rise again if mistreated after death. Early bodies were buried in simple, shallow oval pits, with a few burial goods. Sometimes multiple people and animals were placed in the same grave. Over time, graves became more complex, with the body placed in a wicker basket, then later in wooden or terracotta coffins. But the latest tombs Egyptians have made are sarcophaguses. These graves contained burial goods like jewelry, food, games and sharpened splint. This demonstrates that this ancient period had a sense of the afterlife. Though archaeological evidence may show the average person had little chance of getting into it, this may be because admission required that the deceased must be able to serve a purpose there. The pharaoh was allowed in because of his role in life, and others needed to have some role there. Human sacrifices found in early royal tombs reinforce this view. These people were probably meant to serve the pharaoh during his eternal life. Eventually, figurines and wall paintings begin to replace human victims. Some of these figurines may have been created to resemble certain people, so they could follow the pharaoh after their lives ended. Note that not only the lower classes had to rely on the pharaoh's favor, but also the noble classes. They believed that when he died, the pharaoh became a type of god, who could bestow upon certain individuals the ability to have an afterlife. This belief existed from the pre-dynastic period through the Old Kingdom. Though many spells from the predeceasing texts were carried over, the new coffin texts also had additional new spells added, along with slight changes made to make this new funerary text more relatable to the nobility. In the first intermediate period, however, the importance of the pharaoh declined. Funerary texts, previously restricted to royal use, became more widely available. The pharaoh was no longer a god-king in the sense that only he was allowed in the next life due to his status here. Now he was merely the ruler of the population who upon his death would be leveled down towards the plane of the mortals. Prehistory. Earliest burials. The first farmers in Egypt are known from the villages of Omari and Mahdi in the north. The people of these villages buried their dead in a simple, round, graves with one pot. The body was neither treated nor arranged in a regular way as would be the case later in the historical period. Without any written evidence, there is little to provide information about contemporary beliefs concerning the afterlife except for the regular inclusion of a single pot in the grave. In view of later customs, the pot was probably intended to hold food for the deceased. Pre-dynastic period. Development of customs. Funerary customs developed during the pre-dynastic period from those of the prehistoric period. At first people excavated round graves with one pot in the Badarian period, continuing the tradition of Omari and Mahdi cultures. By the end of the pre-dynastic period, there were increasing numbers of objects deposited with the body in rectangular graves, and there is growing evidence of rituals practiced by Egyptians of the Naqada II period. At this point, bodies were regularly arranged in a crouched or fetal position with the face toward either the east, the rising sun, or the west. Artists painted jars with funeral processions and perhaps ritual dancing. Figures of bare-breasted women with bird-like faces and their legs concealed under skirts also appeared in some graves. Some graves were much richer in goods than others, demonstrating the beginnings of social stratification. Gender differences in burial emerged with the inclusion of weapons in men's graves and cosmetics palettes in women's graves. Early dynastic period, tombs and coffins by the First Dynasty. Some Egyptians were wealthy enough to build tombs over their burials rather than placing their bodies in simple pit graves dug into the sand. The rectangular, mud-brick tomb with an underground burial chamber, called a mastaba, developed in this period. Since commoners as well as kings, however, had such tombs, the architecture suggests that in death, some wealthy people did achieve an elevated status. Later in the historical period, it is certain that the deceased was associated with the god of the dead, Osiris. Grave goods expanded to include furniture, jewelry, and games, as well as the weapons, cosmetic palettes, and food supplies in decorated jars known earlier, in the pre-dynastic period. Now, however, in the richest tombs, grave goods numbered in the thousands. Only the newly invented coffins for the body were made specifically for the tomb. There is also some inconclusive evidence for mummification. Other objects in the tombs that had been used during daily life suggest that Egyptians already in the First Dynasty anticipated needing in the next life. Further continuity from this life into the next can be found in the positioning of tombs. Those persons who served the king during their lifetimes chose burials in close proximity to their lord. The use of stela in front of the tomb began in the First Dynasty, indicating a desire to individualize the tomb with the deceased's name. Old Kingdom, pyramids and mummification in the Old Kingdom. Kings first built pyramids for their own tombs surrounded by stone mastaba tombs for their high officials. The fact that most high officials were also royal relatives suggests another motivation for such placement. These complexes were also family cemeteries. Among the elite, bodies were now mummified, wrapped in linen bandages, sometimes covered with molded plaster, and placed in stone sarcophagi or plain wooden coffins. At the end of the Old Kingdom, mummy masks in cartonnage also appeared. Canopic containers now held their internal organs. Amulets of gold, faience, and carnelian first appeared in various shapes to protect different parts of the body. There is also first evidence of inscriptions inside the coffins of the elite during the Old Kingdom. Often, reliefs of everyday items were etched onto the walls, supplemented grave goods, which made them available through their representation. The Nuforce Doll was a non-functioning stone sculpture of a door into the tomb. Found either inside the chapel or on the outside of the mastaba, it served as a place to make offerings and recite prayers for the deceased. Statues of the deceased were now included in tombs and used for ritual purposes. Burial chambers of some private people received their first decorations in addition to the decoration of the chapels. At the end of the Old Kingdom, the burial chamber decorations depicted offerings, but not people. First Intermediate Period, regional variation. The political situation in the First Intermediate Period, with many centers of power, is clearly reflected in the many local styles of art and burial at this time. The many regional styles for decorating coffins make their origins easy to distinguish from each other. For example, some coffins have one-line inscriptions, and many styles include the depiction of wadjet eyes. There are also regional variations in the hieroglyphs used to decorate coffins. Occasionally men had tools and weapons in their graves, while some women had jewelry and cosmetic objects such as mirrors. Grindstones were sometimes included in women's tombs, perhaps to be considered a tool for food preparation in the next world. Just as the weapons in men's tombs imply men's assignment to a role in fighting. Middle Kingdom, new tomb contents. Burial customs in the Middle Kingdom reflect some of the political trends of this period. During the 11th dynasty, tombs were cut into the mountains of Thebes surrounding the king's tomb or in local cemeteries in Upper and Middle Egypt. Thebes was the native city of the 11th dynasty kings, and they preferred to be buried there. But the 12th dynasty, High officials served the kings of a new family now ruling from the north in Lish. These kings and their high officials preferred burial in a mastaba near the pyramids belonging to their masters. Moreover, the difference in topography between Thebes and Lisht led to a different tomb type. In the north, nobles build mastaba tombs on the flat desert plains, while in the south, local dignitaries continued to excavate tombs in the mountain. For those of ranks lower than royal courtiers during the 11th dynasty, tombs were simpler. Coffins could be simple wooded boxes with the body either mummified and wrapped in linen or simply wrapped without mummification, and the addition of a cartonnage mummy mask. Some tombs included wooded shoes and a simple statue near the body. In one burial there were only 12 loaves of bread, a leg of beef, and a jar of beer for food offerings. Jewelry could be included, but only rarely were objects of great value found in non-elite graves. Some burials continued to include the wooden models that were popular during the First Intermediate period. Wooden models of boats, scenes of food production, craftsmen and workshops, and professions such as scribes or soldiers have been found in the tombs of this period. Some rectangular coffins of the 12th dynasty have short inscriptions and representations of the most important offerings the deceased required. For men, the objects depicted were weapons and symbols of office as well as food. Women's coffins depicted mirrors, sandals, and jars containing food and drink. Some coffins included texts that were later versions of the royal pyramid texts. Another kind of faience model of the deceased as a mummy seems to anticipate the use of shati figurines later in the 12th dynasty. These early figurines do not have the text directing the figure to work in the place of the deceased that is found in later figurines. The richest people had stone figurines that seem to anticipate shatis, though some scholars have seen them as mummy substitutes rather than servant figures. In the later 12th dynasty, significant changes occurred in burials, perhaps reflecting administrative changes enacted by King Senwosret III. The body was now regularly placed on its back rather than its side as had been done for thousands of years. Coffin texts and wooden models disappeared from new tombs of the period, while heart scarabs and figurines shaped like mummies were now often included in burials, as they would be for the remainder of Egyptian history. Coffin decoration was simplified. The 13th dynasty saw another change in decoration. Different motifs were found in the north and south, a reflection of decentralized government power at the time. There were also a marked increase in the number of burials in one tomb, a rare occurrence in earlier periods. The reuse of one tomb by a family over generations seems to have occurred when wealth was more equitably spread. Second Intermediate period. Foreigner burials. Known graves from the Second Intermediate period reveal the presence of non-Egyptians buried in the country. In the north, graves associated with the Hyksos, a Western Semitic people ruling the north from the northeast delta, include small mud brick structures containing the body, pottery vessels, a dagger and a men's graves, and often a nearby donkey burial. Simple pan-shaped graves in various parts of the country are thought to belong to Nubian soldiers. Such graves reflect very ancient customs and feature shallow, round pits, bodies contracted, and minimal food offerings in pots. The occasional inclusion of identifiable Egyptian materials from the Second Intermediate period provides the only marks distinguishing these burials from those of pre-dynastic and even earlier periods. New Kingdom, new object purposes. The majority of elite tombs in the New Kingdom were rock-cut chambers. Kings were buried in multi-roomed, rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings and no longer in pyramids. Priests conducted funerary rituals for them in stone temples built on the west bank of the Nile opposite of Thebes. From the current evidence, the 18th dynasty appears to be the last period in which Egyptians regularly included multiple objects from their daily lives in their tombs. Beginning in the 19th dynasty, tombs contained fewer items from daily life and included objects made especially for the next world. Thus the change from the 18th to the 19th dynasties formed a dividing line in burial traditions. The 18th dynasty more closely remembered the immediate past in its customs, whereas the 19th dynasty anticipated the customs of the late period. People of the elite ranks in the 18th dynasty placed furniture as well as clothing and other items in their tombs. Objects they undoubtedly used during life on earth. Beds, headrests, chairs, stools, leather sandals, jewelry, musical instruments, and wooden storage chests were present in these tombs. While all of the objects listed were for the elite, many poor people did not put anything beyond weapons and cosmetics into their tombs. No elite tombs survive unplundered from the Ramesside period. In this period, artists decorated tombs belonging to the elite with more scene of religious events, rather than the everyday scene that had been popular since the Old Kingdom. The funeral itself, the funerary meal with multiple relatives, the worshipping of the gods, even figures in the underworld were subjects in elite tomb decorations. The majority of objects found in Ramesside period tombs were made for the afterlife. Aside from the jewelry, which could have been used also during life, objects in Ramesside tombs were manufactured for the next world. Third Intermediate period. Though the political structure of the New Kingdom collapsed at the end of the 20th dynasty, the majority of burials in the 21st dynasty directly reflect developments from the earlier period. At the beginning of this time, reliefs resembled those from the Ramesside period. Only at the very end of the Third Intermediate period did new funerary practices of the late period begin to be seen. Little is known of tombs from this period. The very lack of decorations in tombs seem to have led to much more elaborate decoration of coffins. The remaining grave goods of the period show fairly cheaply made shatties, even when the owner was a queen or a princess. Late period, monumentality and return to traditions. Burials in the late period could make use of large-scale, temple-like tombs built for the non-royal elite for the first time, but the majority of tombs in this period were in shafts sunk into the desert floor. In addition to fine statuary and reliefs reflecting the style of the Old Kingdom, the majority of grave goods were specially made for the tomb. Coffins continued to bear religious texts and scenes. Some shafts were personalized by the use of stela with the deceased prayers and name on it. Shatties in faience for all classes are known. Canopic jars, though often non-functional, continued to be included. Staves and scepters representing the deceased's office in life were often present as well. A figure of either the god Osiris or of the composite deity Ptah Soka Osiris could be found, along with heart scarabs. Both golden faience examples of djed columns, Eye of Horus amulets, figures of gods, and images of the deceased's bar. Tools for the tomb's ritual called the opening of the mouth, as well as magical bricks at the 4 compass points could be included. Ptolemaic period, Hellenistic influences. Following Egypt's conquest by Alexander the Great, the country was ruled by the descendants of Ptolemy, one of his generals. The Macedonian Greek family fostered a culture that promoted both Hellenistic and ancient Egyptian ways of life. While many Greek-speaking people living in Alexandria followed the customs of mainland Greece, others adopted Egyptian customs, while Egyptians continued to follow their own already ancient customs. Very few Ptolemaic tombs are known. Fine temple statuary of the period suggests the possibility of tomb sculpture and offering tables. Egyptian elite burials still made use of stone sarcophagi. Books of the dead and amulets were also still popular. Roman period, Roman influences. The Romans conquered Egypt in 30 BC, ending the rule of the last and most famous member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra VII. During Roman rule, an elite hybrid burial style developed incorporating both Egyptian and Roman elements. Some people were mummified and wrapped in linen bandages. The front of the mummy was often painted with a selection of traditional Egyptian symbols. Mummy masks in either traditional Egyptian style or in Roman style could be added to the mummies. Another possibility was a Roman-style mummy portrait, executed in encaustic on a wooden panel. Sometimes the feet of the mummy were covered. An alternative to this was a complete shroud with Egyptian motifs, but a portrait in the Roman style. Tombs of the elite could also include fine jewelry. Tombs. In the prehistoric Egypt, bodies were buried in deserts because they would naturally be preserved by dehydration. The graves were small oval or rectangular pits dug in the sand. They could give the body of the deceased in a tight position on its left side alongside a few jars of food and drink and slate pallets with magical, religious spells. The size of graves eventually increased, but according to status and wealth. The dry, desert conditions were a benefit in ancient Egypt for burials of the poor, who could not afford the complex burial preparations that the wealthy had. The simple graves evolved into mud brick structures called mastabas. Royal mastabas later developed into step pyramids, and then true pyramids. As soon as a king took the throne, he would start to build his pyramid. Rituals of the burial, including the opening of the mouth ceremony, took place at the Valley Temple. While a pyramid's large size was made to protect against robbery, it may also be connected to a religious belief about the sun god, Ra.